Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents The Cavalry Cycle. This time we'll continue our reading of Cold Yule, Buckjack. They were now leaving the residential stretch of Oakwood Street for the stores where people bustled about their Christmas shopping, until they saw John. He remembered how self-conscious he had been the first time he walked down the street in Upham, his first public appearance after transformation. The feeling had passed off almost immediately. There he was no novel sight, and no one stared. Here, at first he just registered extra tumult and staring faces. Then he began to sort out different reactions. Most just stared, simply because he was an unusual sight. Many of these even smiled a bit. He was not just unusual, but a wonder. Some others wound up on the far side of the street from him, either in a casual drift or a deliberate stride. He knew all of them, of course, at least slightly, whether they welcomed or shunned. Many welcomers called greetings, not always accurately. "John! Jeff!" "Jeff?" "Jack!" He gamely smiled, waved back, and greeted. Chloe, who might as well have been invisible, led him all the way to the far end of the stores, where they gave way to the docks and boat sheds. At the boundary was Talbot and Massey's, a small department store. They both entered. The place was full of Christmas shoppers, of course, virtually all turning to stare at them. John got an excellent view from his 7-foot height. Besides people, the place was full of shelving and clothing racks and displays and bins. Ordinary people had trouble moving. And then there was John. This, like his parents' house, was exactly what agility class had been for. He had once seen a television show testing the adage about a bull in a china shop, letting a bull wander freely through a studio full of shelves and tables stacked with dishes. The bull, not knowing what was wanted, not equipped with a human-esque nervous system to grant agility, nevertheless did no damage. How much safer was John in Talbot and Massey's? But agility class was just practice. The public places in Upham were scaled to his size, and his family, whatever else they thought, did not think he was bad for business. John suddenly realized he was now practicing his agility skills for real. "What's the matter with you?" Chloe asked from behind a cheerful but stiff smile directed at the crowd. "Stage fright," he murmured back, trying to smile himself. "I don't want to knock into anything." "Then stop tap dancing." He realized he was rocking back and forth on shifting hooves, prancing in place. He stilled himself and remembered those self-same agility lessons, took a deep, calming breath. This went on for a bit, and he noticed Chloe blink as the flank next to her started to expand, but her smile softened and she nodded. She squared her shoulders again, he did too, and Team Weldon, Infantry and Cavalry, advanced. "What are we here for?" he asked. "Just pine garlands, garden section." "In back, it would be." John noticed that, naturally enough, people got out of his way faster than out of Chloe's. So it was only chivalrous, he thought, that he draw slightly ahead of her to clear her path. Not that he charged in, scattering the foe before him. He shuffled down the aisle slowly, smiling constantly, tipping his hat and saying "excuse me" whenever he bumped anyone, or, as was really commoner, anyone bumped him. He got all the same reactions as on the street. In addition, the close proximity made people, the friendly ones, more conversational. "John, how are you feeling?" "I'm fine. You?" "Welcome home." "Thank you." That was sweet to hear. He felt his smile soften. "John, Jeff coming too?" "Tomorrow. Want to see both of you." His eyes pricked. So sentimental now. "But..." Well, Stallion Jack, I thought Donna made a gelding out of you years ago." "Fuddle you, Frank," John thought, groped for a retort using the word trample, then changed his mind and simply walked away. "John, all three of you? What do your parents think?" Mrs. Pauley or Paulus or something. He didn't know her very well, nor she them if she thought Peter was already changed. Other negative encounters were limited to an aghast stare or an anxious shuffling away. But up close, he noticed another reaction, playing it cool, with a casual smile and no wide eyes. It was a nonchalance more studied than the genuine thing from Upham, meant to say, I'm sundered and proud of it. I live in Le Monde Majeur. I'm not going to freak out over this. If a Chinese dragon wants to come shop at Talbot and Massey's, it won't bother me. That worked for John. The garden section was outside on a wide platform. At this point, where the docks started, Oakwood Street ran along the tops of modest cliffs, 2 or 3 yards high. The garden section platform thrust out from these, providing a bit of shelter for some heavy-duty maritime goods on the beach below. Christmas was distinctly maritime in Grand Normandy, even more so on Oakwood Street, running along the shore of a coastal town. The garden section featured Christmas trees pre-decorated with shells, toy fish and ships, and larger Santa ship displays for lawn and roof. St. Nicholas, patron of sailors and children, rode a ship through the sky, not a sleigh, as far as Grand Norman kids were concerned. And, John reflected happily as he turned about in the more open space of the platform, if you were sundered, you never need feel it had to be untrue. He cast a speculative eye at the night sky over the sea, as he knew most Grand Normans did at this time of year, adult or not. He knew that inland at Upham they added a local variation. A team from the dedicated Cavalry pulled St. Nicholas representative around the town in a sleigh as he tossed candy to the kids. He knew his barracks mates, Paul Fell, was on the team for the sake of his 4-year-old daughter. The sales clerk, Joe Massey, had never had to pack pine garland for harness before, but he was game. John coached him through it. It wasn't very heavy, but it would have been bulky for a human simple to carry around. Its main drawback was how it prickled. Joe noticed his hide twitching and thoughtfully slid sheets of wrapping paper under the garland bundles. Joe was of the never bat an eye school. John bought a string of hand-sized paper ships for the mantel at home. Then they turned to plow back through the store to the street. We want a salmon for supper tomorrow, Chloe said, looking down Oakwood to the fish market. It was on the docks just past a bend in the road. The bend, in fact. Oakwood Street continued for some distance beyond it, and Grand Norman folk dominated the docks there, but they began to give way to prosaic folk. The bend was not in itself enchanted, but it was the boundary at which the Grand Normans began taking pains to discourage interest from prosaic stirk. Police patrols never got routed past the bend, postal deliveries didn't come, the Grand Normans fetched their mail themselves from boxes at the post office, and so forth. All done by careful, sometimes magical, tampering with records and schedules. It worked. They were lucky in their tamperings, with the luck that was the sundering. The flip side was that one did not show anything paranormal or magical, anything of the Monde Major past the bend. Anything like John, in fact. Chloe looked up at him. I'll wait here, he said. I'll just be a few minutes. She strode toward the fish market. John spread his legs, locked his knees, folded his arms across his chest, and leaned back. He could stay this way as comfortably as he had once sat in armchairs. He could even doze this way as a horse could, not that he intended to. For one thing, he had company. While shopping adults hurried by, staring at him, smiling and nodding, crossing the street, or playing it cool, 3 children came up and just looked at him. They were 2 boys of 10 or 11 and a girl somewhat younger but still older than Lucy. Hi, said John. They said hi back. The boys wore St. Ambrose uniforms. That was the school that Peter attended, though these were a couple of years younger. John thought he recognized one of the boys and the girl. Are you a Castaner? He asked the familiar boy. Yes, sir. John twitched a smile. He was much more used to giving out sirs than to getting them. Robert Castaner, this is my friend Andy Strasser. This is my sister Charlotte. The boy spoke English, not Chenelaise, probably for the benefit of his friend Andy, so John switched too. How do you do? I'm John Weldon. He leaned over and shook hands, which they seemed to enjoy. During the second handshake, a tingling stroke down the ribs he had not had last year made him shy out of his resting stance. He looked back and down and met the eyes of Charlotte, her hands still upraised. That tickles, he said, smiling. Sorry, that's okay. He shook hands with Charlotte, then crouched down on the sidewalk to bring his head nearer the children's level. "Were you giving rides last year?" asked Robert. "No, that was my brother. We'll be giving rides this year too, I expect." "Where were you last year?" "Here, but last year I was human simple." "Human simple?" asked Andy, speaking for the first time. "Just human and nothing more." Andy nodded and quoted to himself in a murmur, "Last year I was human." He looked very thoughtful. Then, in something of the tone of a journalist interviewing a source, he said, "I heard that all Grand Norman men had to do 14 years of service as, in your shape. Is that right?" So Andy was indeed not Grand Norman, though evidently sundered. Before his own transformation, John had traveled a lot with his family and heard various misconceptions about the dedicated cavalry in different corners of the Monde Major, but this was a new one. "No, not everyone. We're a special group of volunteer soldiers. There really aren't many of us. Our tour of duty lasts 14 years, but the shape is permanent." "Told you," said Robert sotto voce. Andy nodded, still absorbing John's information. "Why permanent?" Andy asked. "The transformation was a kind called transubstantiation. Do you know what that means?" Andy shrugged, basically, no. "It means this is my true shape now. There's no disenchanting me back to man simple." "But," Andy objected, "if you used to have one true shape and now you have another, why can't you go on to have another? And why couldn't it be the same as the first one?" It was John's turn to shrug. "It's possible, but transubstantiations are hard to come by. We don't know where to get one like that." "Do you have to stop here at the bend?" Charlotte asked. John nodded. "It seems like a good idea. I'm waiting for my sister. She went to the fish market." He stared along the road. Going to the fish market was not exactly a treat, but it was bright and bustling with the chance of meeting folk from anywhere. And there were stores in ordinary Mond Minor Stirk that he liked visiting, and a park that always had a nice Christmas display. And basically, there was the whole Mond Minor. Ah, well. "Could you go in disguise?" asked Andy, who thus rose in John's estimation. He would have to ask Peter if he knew him. "Yes, I do have a disguise, a t-shirt that glamours me to look like a horse. But it would look odd for my sister to bring a horse with her to the fish market." The kids laughed. "Is it true about the arrow?" Andy asked. "We do get transformed by being shot with an enchanted arrow, yes." "Did it hurt?" asked Charlotte. "No, I just felt confused." "Very." "But didn't you know they were going to do it?" asked Charlotte. "No, not that kind of confusion. He needed a comparison. It seemed unlikely that all three kids had been knocked on the head at some time. "One time," Robert offered, "Barbara forgot to water our wine and we got dizzy and stupid. That kind of confused?" "More like that," John agreed. He forbore to ask who Barbara was, but noted Andy's wide eyes. Children probably did not get wine at his house. "But it didn't hurt, no time. One moment you're standing there waiting for it, then you get shot, there's the confusion, and the next moment you're lying on the ground with 4 legs. "And a tail," Charlotte pointed out. "Yes, indeed." He grinned and switched it for her. "What's it feel like?" Andy asked, venturing the question Axel had not. John cocked his head and looked helpless. "I can't say. What's it feel like to have toes and 2 legs?" "But you remember." "Actually, no, I don't. Can you tell me?" He smiled at Andy's bafflement. "But are you okay?" Charlotte asked, apparently concerned for him. "It doesn't feel bad, does it?" "Oh, no, not at all. I feel—" Except for a few bumps and scrapes from rough exercise and some periods of fatigue, ditto, he had felt, without interruption, physically excellent. He had been about to say that, but suddenly thought it might not be wise to seem to be recruiting. "Quite comfortable," he concluded firmly. "Why did you do it?" asked Andy. "The better to go exploring," John answered, and launched into a jumbled but enthusiastic description of his family's trips out of zone, his glimpses of Yasad Khonsu and the Chaos Marches, what he had heard of the Road to the Sun and Brendan's Reach, and on and on. Chloe came back a few minutes later to find him standing facing the sea, flanked by the boys, with Charlotte on his man-shoulders, all engaged in keeping lookout for St. Nick's ship, and speculating on the odds of finding its home port out there somewhere. All were oblivious to the stares of the shoppers passing behind them. Some smiled, some just stared, none frowned. She paused to consider whether he looked fatherly or just like the biggest kid by a large size margin. "Who are your friends, Jack?" she asked. She was quickly introduced to Charlotte, Robert, and Andy. Andy's mother is a mage, and his father runs a museum with sundered bits in Yorkshire. He's been bitten twice, but it didn't take either time. "Good. I got the fish. Can I tuck it in the harness somewhere?" They tucked, then parted from the kids with promises of rides on Christmas. "I see the charm campaign is still going strong," Chloe said. "What? Never mind. Do you think you can fit into David's? He made it all boutiquey and crowded." An hour and 3 shops later, they began wandering home. There was the driftwood. Maybe they could stop in there for a coffee or a beer. How would Mr. Ricard greet him? Then a man came out, big, stocky, in a dark work jacket and knit cap, blunt and familiar face, pulled a list out of his pocket, looked up, and saw him. The man flinched and sagged against the doorframe as if shot. Walter Cosser was just stepping out of the driftwood, Christmas shopping list in his hand. He was always put off shopping awkwardly late. It was a chore he didn't know how to do right. That was reason, he knew, to get started on it early, but he never did. He envied his wife, who enjoyed it and did it bit at a time around the year. Then his peripheral vision caught something big in the wrong place. A glance up. At first, he thought it was a cowboy on horseback, which made no sense. Then he saw the reality, which was worse. It was John, Dominic Weldon's son. That's right. He'd lost 2 now. The shy boy John had been, always tagging around after Donna What's-Her-Name. Then Cosser heard she'd thrown him over and he'd run off to join the army. Only not to be a soldier, he'd then heard, but to transform, like his older brother. And here he was, more than a head taller than the crowd, and he might have looked dashing with his cowboy hat and army jacket, but half of him was gone, replaced with a great prancing horse body. Cosser experienced the kind of shock one got from realizing the man you were looking at was a double amputee, and the shock of finding a large animal where you expected none. And then he tumbled into a full-on flashback. Cosser was a longshoreman down at the Stirk docks. Being Grand Norman and sundered, he had free access to the people and places the Mondain miners could never get around to finding. And so the traders, Grand Norman and other Mondain majors, made good use of him and his mates, doing their bit to move goods around the Mond Major. 4 years ago, 3 other carriers had vanished, all on the same night: Harry Morley, Rollo Petrie, and Rufus Curran. It was a big loss to a little neighborhood like Oakwood Street, and of course Cosser had known them well. Dame Sarah had done everything she could. You couldn't say otherwise. Oakwood Street being such a small enclave, Dame Sarah Faber was squire lady and constable both in one. She had investigated as best she could, questioned everyone, even brought in a bishop to collect testimonies under oath, even humbled herself to ask help of Arthur Studdock, supposed visionary for the daft Logres folk over at St. Anne's. She had cleared the neighborhood of suspicion, but found no answers. A sickening mixture of grief and uncertainty was left behind, weighing heaviest on the families of the missing men. Then, a year and a half later, and so in summer, 2.5 years ago, Cosser had finished a night shift at the Stirk docks and early in the morning was walking home by way of the beach to stretch out his muscles. "Walt!" the hoarse voice called behind him. He turned to see a man crawling out of the sea. Something was wrong. He didn't move right. He looked at Cosser and called, "Walt!" louder, clearer. The voice was familiar. Then he hoisted himself clear of the water. "It's me, Harry!" It was Harry Morley, naked, white, face hidden behind 2 feet of beard, 3 feet of hair streaming down his back. But he stopped at the waist, and beyond that was a fishtail, 6 feet long, smoke gray and scaly, with dark brown fins here and there, the same color as Harry's hair. "Walt, don't run, please," he'd called, hoarse again, and Cosser had seen the gills flapping and panting just where flesh gave way to scales, in time with Harry's gasping. A second later, he realized he had taken a step back, several steps. In fact, he must have skipped back 2 or 3 yards. Harry did not look dangerous, quite the reverse, but he looked very, very strange, and it took Cossor some effort to approach his old friend. He was sorry that he flinched when Harry reached out a hand, cold and pale, and grabbed his own hand. "Walt, please go fetch Tilly." Tilly was Harry's wife. The hand clenching his still wore a wedding ring. Cossor nodded, but Harry held on. "You're so warm, hot. Please, fetch Tilly." He let go. Cossor nodded again and ran up to the street. He had run back to Oakwood Street, to Tilly's house. After her astonished shriek and demand of where, he had run to Dame Sarah's house. She had been out, but her husband had started dialing the phone. He had then headed back to the beach, but remembering Harry's icy hands, had stopped to buy, nearly steal in his haste, a styrofoam cup of coffee. No hot drinks in the sea, any more than barber shops. The beach had seemed empty when he first returned. Come on, it's not like I'm Mond Minor," he growled aloud, peering about. Then Harry had surfaced again and come crawling and thrashing out of the water. "She'll be right along," he told Harry, and this time it did not take an effort to put an arm around the wet white shoulder and pass the hot cup into his hand. "Thank you, Walt," said Harry. This time his voice was clear, and Cossor noted he had clamped down his gills and taken a deep breath before speaking. He hung his head over the cup for a while, not drinking yet. Sobs shook his shoulders and huffed out his gills. "My eyes hurt," he remarked. "Can't cry properly now." Cossor's heart took another sting. "Harry!" It was Tilly running down the beach. She hesitated not at all, but ran into his arms. Cossor stepped back and gave the two of them their own sundering to hide in for a bit. He could still hear the weeping. After a while, he heard footsteps behind him on the sand. He turned to face Dame Sarah. Her son, Guillaume Faber, was with her. He was tall, bony, and fair, like her, ostensibly a trader, but really, if unofficially, the assistant constable, someday to take over from his mother. "It's Morley?" she asked. "You're sure?" "Yes'm, and she's sure." He gestured at Tilly, still in the merman's embrace. Slightly surprising Cossor, Dame Sarah and Gil waited patiently with him, giving the couple time. When, apparently, they had said all they could to each other, Dame Sarah approached, followed by Gil. Cossor trailed after, feeling unsure of his welcome, but intensely curious. The Fabers, mother and son, quizzed Harry thoroughly for clues about his fate. He, Rufus, and Rollo had been sent to a dock with loads for a non-existent boat, then had been seized from behind. Strong, expert hands had pried their jaws open and stuffed something in like wet leaves, then pushed them in the water. A strange desperation had come over him. He could not wait an instant to breathe the water. There was a time of gasping and floundering, and when he had come to himself, his pants and boots had fallen off, and he found himself as he was now. But shorter. At first my tail was no longer than my legs had been. A pair of fins below his waist flapped, the last of his legs. "Now look at it! What if I become a sea serpent?" Tilly squeaked a sob. Dame Sarah said stoutly, "Then you'll be better equipped to tackle whoever did this to you. What about Petrie and Curran? What's become of them?" Harry did not know. They had surfaced some distance from the wharf, gasping out of habit, already suspecting what had become of them, and soon verifying it by touch. Then something huge had brushed them in the dark water. There was nothing for it but to flee. The presence, whatever it was, had chased them, herded them, felt behind them as a looming pressure. For hours, it had seemed, the three new mermen had expected sharp teeth and an end, but it never came. The thing departed around dawn, and they were left far out at sea. Rollo had become scaly and finny like Harry, but Rufus, poor, gentle, slightly tubby Rufus, found he now had a shark's tail and back fin. They had started back, of course, keeping together, keeping spirits up, even planning new careers as fishermen or undersea crewmen on or with trade ships, and, of course, wondering why this had been done to them. But when they sighted land, it was weeks later, and somewhere in Africa, as best they could judge from the signage at the docks. They must have been thrown off course by currents, and they reckoned by some magic of confusion, like pixie leading. Doggedly, they had started working north toward home, but they had been slow because they had had to learn to live in the sea, what to hunt, what to eat, what to flee. He had lost Rollo and Rufus in a storm. They had not drowned, obviously, but they had simply lost track of each other. After a week of looking around, Harry had given up and continued north. His best chance of seeing them, he figured, was to meet them here at Stirk. Dame Sarah questioned him closely about the customers and cargoes, docks and ships, and all the other details of his work in the days before his transformation, but it had been a year and a half ago. He did not remember a great deal. He pleaded instead to know what was going on. "I believe you and your mates knew something," said Dame Sarah, certainly without realizing the importance of it, "and someone wanted you and your information out of the way, but not dead. Maybe they're under a no-kill geas. Maybe they don't want your ghosts available for questioning. The other possibility is it was some kind of sacrifice. But we have you, anyway, alive and well." Well? Legless? Cossor looked again at the helplessly waving leg fins, and writhing like a hooked fish? Could he even control that? He looked at Harry's face, dry now, but still looking white and drowned and lost. He followed Harry's gaze, now at Tilly's face, now over her shoulder to the row of buildings above the beach. At that point, Dame Sarah turned to Cossor, thanked him, then politely but firmly shooed him away, and told him to keep the affair quiet until he heard from Gil or her or Tilly. Cossor kept silent for a while, but Rufus and Rollo's families had to be told, and between them and Tilly it became known on Oakwood Street what had happened to Harry. And Tilly knew that he knew, so she came round to have someone to talk to, which really meant Cossor's wife. By sitting at the table and listening to the two women talk, Cossor learned that Harry's return had been no happy ending, nor an ending at all. Tilly was, of course, happy to have him back, downright delirious the first few days. But she had him back maimed, mutilated, legless, as surely as the wife of any luckless soldier. He had no occupation on land anymore, and could find no occupation in water except to swim. This drove Tilly frantic, because if he swam too far out, or more to the point, too deep, he started to lose track of time and place, and sometimes did not come back for days. Soon enough, Tilly and their kids moved away, with Dame Sarah's help, to Cote Dees in Berkel, the near zone. Harry was to follow them. There were other merfolk in Cote Dees, and something could be made of that. Cossor had not seen Harry since. Instead, he had nightmares. He dreamt of drowning. He dreamt of the stormy sea at night and hearing Harry, Rollo, or Rufus screaming. Worst was the dream where he floundered in the water as a great fish loomed out of the depth and swallowed him up to the waist, then sank in its teeth and started growing into him. "What are you doing?" Chloe demanded. "I just want to say hello to Walt Cossor over there. He looks upset. I thought I'd let him know that things are all right." Chloe grabbed a handful of jacket and, as it were, reined him in. "Think twice. Remember how he lost his mate Harry?" "Oh, right." But Cossor was looking at him face to face now. All he could do was smile. The creature, Jack Weldon he used to be, locked eyes with him. The sister had grabbed its jacket like she was holding it back, but he just smiled at Cossor, sadly. Cossor flashed back to Harry again, face sad and pale. He glanced at the restless horse legs and thought about the twisting fishtail. He felt the remaining blood leave his own face. He nodded to Jack and turned back quickly. Though he scarcely knew the Weldons, he felt bad about it later, as if he'd snubbed a friend. But it was too much like Harry, half destroyed. We'll find out more about how the neighborhood reacts to Jack next time.